Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's keynote lecture from the Digital Good Network. It's amazing to see so many people in the room. Ruth, how many folks have we got joining us online tonight so far? Can we see? 40 people online. So, oh wait, cumulatively, I mean, I can't do maths any day, but who knows how many folks are out here. I'm going to go with at least 100. So 100 people watching me right now. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Roz. I'm an associate director of the Digital Good Network, and we're so thrilled to have you all joining us here for the first of our keynotes attached to our annual Digital Good Network showcase, of which some in the room have been attending today. I've already mentioned, but some folks have yet joined us. So we are going to be photographed today by a professional photographer. If you would prefer not to be in photographs, can I suggest that you move yourself to that side of the room, please? As part of the Digital Good Network, we are committed to building an inclusive research culture. And for that reason, I'm going to do something that some of you will find a little strange. I'm going to provide a visual description of myself so that those who cannot see me fully, who are perhaps online, who have visual impairments, can imagine what I look like. And you'd be thrilled to imagine it because I have short hair. It's quite buoyant today. I'm going to stand right in front of the owl so people can see me as well. I'm wearing a green shirt that I think is quite fetching. I'm a mixed race woman. I use they, them, she, her pronouns. And I'm wearing, as my PhD student Marissa told me today, some very dashing white new kicks. So thank you all so much for listening to that. Over the course of the Digital Good Network's life, we're lucky that we're going to get to host a range of keynote speakers who are really working at the forefront of their respective fields and disciplines. The keynote of our first network showcase is absolutely no exception. Charlton McIlwain serves as Vice Provost for Faculty Development, Pathways, and Public Interest Technology at New York University Steinhardt, where he is a professor of media, culture, and communication. Charlton's background is distinctively interdisciplinary. Though his PhD was in communications, he has a master's in human relations and a BA in family psychology. And his scholarship demonstrates an enduring commitment to understanding the interrelation between media and technology, political action, and racial justice. His earlier work explores the mobilization of ideas of race in US political elections, whilst more recent scholarship looks at politics on the ground as people of color organize politically in the technological and media environment. And this coalesced in the 2020 Oxford University Press monograph, Black Software. Once you read it, you could be forgiven that thinking Charlton can add historian to his disciplinary repertoire too. The book, in two halves, tells a story that reaches back through decades of what he calls Black software. On one hand, created by and for Black users, and on the other, created with the intention of policing them. I suspect Charlton will discuss that book, so no more from me other than a strong recommendation that you all immediately order a copy after the talk. So Charlton oversees now the New York University Alliance of Public Interest Technology, which brings together the university's faculty experts to collaborate with each other and with partners on the creation, use, and governance of technology in society, which is, of course, of great interest to our network. He's also the founder for the Center of Critical Race and Digital Studies, the website of which, criticalracedigitalstudies.com, if you're interested, is full of threads to tug on if Charlton's area of work is new to you and you want to learn more about the field, the people, and the scholarship that make it up. So Charlton's going to speak for around 45 minutes, which should give us plenty of time for questions at the end. We've got people joining us online for the event who are welcome at any point to start writing their questions into the Q&A. And for those in the room who doubtless will have loads of questions too, we will have a roving mic and a fantastic PhD student, I am told, running around with it. So if I may now offer Charlton the floor and invite you all to give a massive round of applause.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I can hear myself, so that must mean it's all right. I will continue with the convention of the day and describe myself. I am exactly because I was asked, 72 inches, dark-skinned African-American man, short hair, graying more than I would like, and wearing a dark brown sport coat over a sweater vest, and light tan pants. So I'll start with that and start by thanking Roz for that introduction, thanking everyone, Helen, and others for inviting me to be the keynote speaker for this year's Digital Good Network event. I'll say a number of things by way of preliminaries, caveats, etc. Number one, I want to thank Roz again for plugging the book. I will pay you with that check later for that help. And then I want to talk about, we were discussing earlier, someone mentioned the timing, and of course, you know, is it good, and the event is about to happen. And I was thinking a lot about the timing of this event and what is a good time for a keynote, and there's always an issue around the timing in terms of, at least for me, the headspace or mindset that I'm coming in with it. So today I have the good fortune of being able to take down expectations considerably, because everything that I'm going to say you've already heard for the day, right? Except for folks joining us online and those of you that have joined us newly in person now. Everything I'm going to talk about are things that have been brought up, discussed, some in specific detail already across the day. So that's the challenge of doing a keynote at the end of the day rather than at the beginning. I was also quite amused with Helen's opening this morning. I don't know where Helen is. Oh, there you are. Who opened, of course, with a quote by Ruha Benjamin. And I always feel like, I say this to Ruha, I feel haunted a bit by her presence, because on more than one occasion, I've had the conversation about being invited somewhere, and the conversation goes something like, we're glad to be able to have you as our keynote. We'd originally asked Ruha, but she couldn't make it. So we're glad you're here. Thank you. But I always say, if you've got the choice between the two, choose Ruha. But I think it was also apt, the quote that you began with of hers about not forgetting to imagine the worlds you want to live within as we're dismantling those that we are, I forget the whole quote, but about both imagination and dismantling and doing those things simultaneously. And I'll come back to that later during the course of the talk and our discussion. Also, by way of just context about myself, for those of you that are not too familiar with me or my work, I do consider myself a historian of technology, also one who is very interested in technology futures, and often see those things in tension with each other. And so we'll talk about that quite a bit as well. I'm a social scientist who spent an inordinate amount of my time, both through grad school and the first probably 10 to 15 years of my career, as a social scientist, utilizing many types of database methods, quantitative methods, et cetera. And so that also informs what I do. Long ago, I might claim being an ethnographer that was tied to my work in my doctoral dissertation, which I don't think anyone probably knows, even Roz, who I feel like knows me from inside out, scholarly and brings those things up continuously. But I did my doctoral dissertation on Black family death rituals. And so spent a couple of years doing ethnographic things in relationship to trying to understand how Black communities across the US primarily do this thing that we call death. And so in all of that, and all the work that I've done over the last 23, 24 years, all of that has been deeply centered around, founded around the interest in and commitment to issues around race and equity and inclusion. And so that inflects all of my work and will come up and really be the center of the way I approach this question about the digital good. Last caveat before I get into things, I typically have two types of talks that I give. The one is where I'm well prepared, everything is tied out in a bow. Typically, I like to write things out word for word because I'm a better writer than I am speaker. And so I've got a predetermined beginning and end. That's one type of talk. The second type of talk is usually prompted by the inevitable question, which is, can you give us a title? Very bad with titles. And so especially if that question is asked several months before the talk, then what often happens is the second type of talk, which is I'm gonna give you a title and I'm gonna figure out what I'm gonna say later. And so the title becomes the aspiration and the talk ends up much more like me asking you to follow me in the journey and in my thinking as I work through the title that I gave and am committed to sticking to. So this is talk number 2 of that kind. And it started with the fact that I have a very visceral response to this idea about the digital good. And I can't remember if Helen and Gina somewhere in here remember back, I think we were on a boat in Paris and I was introduced to this network that was still in formation at the time, asked if I might participate in some way. And my response was, of course, yeah, sounds good, right? And then up to the time where I was asked to give a title for the talk, what came to me most immediately was this nomenclature of the digital good, particularly the good part of it. And I recognized that there was something about the good that I had a strong visceral reaction to. And that was the starting point of my thinking. And so as you can see on the slide here, we are awash in digital good things, digital good organizations, sometimes digital good corporations. One of the things that often is a corollary for me in terms of digital good and similar nomenclature is things that end with for all. And so doing good and for all have similar types of resonance with me for very particular reasons that I will get into. So here's some of the things that readily came to my mind when first confronting the idea of the digital good. First was my undergraduate GPA, which was not quite a 1.6 highlighted there, but was around a C. I think it was a 2.7 on a 4-point scale. I majored in family psychology. And for me, coming out and graduating with a 2.7 GPA was good. It was all right. I had no real aspiration at that point. I wasn't going anywhere other than to try to get a job that paid me something coming out of school, right? So it was good. I got what I needed from my education, I thought. And so my 2.7 was, for me, good. Now, it wasn't quite good 2 years later when I decided to go to grad school. And someone was looking and evaluating my application and trying to determine, would I be up to the task of this graduate degree, which I then had to do quite a bit to convince those folks that I was. The next thing that came to mind, how many of you know a place called Oklahoma in the United States? Oh, wow, that's more people than I would have imagined. How many of you know where it is on a map? Yeah, few fewer? All right. Back when I was living in Oklahoma, which was 14 years, this was the license plate. It's the way that we decided to showcase the state. And of course, it was a play on the initials of the state, but the way it reads is the way you see it here, Oklahoma. It's okay. Right? It's not particularly bad or good or this or that, nothing strongly attached to it. It's just all right. And so this is what comes to mind as well. Similar to the GPA, things are just okay. And then, of course, if you are a fan of this show, this comes to mind, our friend Saul Goodman. And the play on words, it's all good, man. So this comes to mind, and of course, if you know the show, you know that all is not good with Saul, right? Stuff happens, bad things happen. Bad things happen that he is the creator of. Everything around him is chaos, but it's all good, right? And so there's this sense of acquiescence, right? Of being okay with my own personal situation. And so this idea about the good, at least in my mind, an initial reaction is about this kind of personal sense that things are okay. Things are good. And that's what I bring to the notion then about the digital good. Also, during my upbringing, I had way too much religion. And so this also came to mind as a final example about what's in my mind when first confronting the idea of digital good. And this is a verse from the King James Version of the Bible. All things work together for good. Anyone know the end of that verse? For them who love the Lord. All right. So here again, we've got this sense that, you know, and I like this image that I was able to find because it gives that view of a kind of automated nature about the way the good works. And so in there is bad stuff and good stuff, things that we'd rather not deal with, things that are uncomfortable, but somehow it all works out for good in the end. And so again, there's this sense of acquiescence, right? Even, at least if you go with this last version, there's a sense that there is a predestined sense in which all this bad stuff is going to happen, and we should just kind of deal with it. Because in the end, it's going to be okay. It's going to work out for good. All of these things map onto those things that first come to mind when confronting the digital good, and why my first reaction to the idea about the digital good is very much in line with what I've mentioned. It's just all right. It's just okay. And so nothing strong. And so for me, the lack of that kind of strength about what the good is leads me to question it, to be a little bit skeptical about not only the notion of the digital good, but the kinds of things that we do under the banner of digital goods. And so that's what I want to spend some of our time here today talking about. And so for me, when we talk about the digital good, what first comes to mind, and this goes back to the book for those of you who have read it, that goes through a history, essentially, of Black people's relationship to computing technology. And so it's in the face of this and some very specific moments long ago in our history, our relatively short computing history, and some more recent that make me understand that the good, at least in my original imagination in some way, is at worst the greatest and epic proportions of grift, a grift of epic proportions, right? The good is that thing that we tell ourselves we're doing while we're all the while doing the same thing that we have always done, right? It's the illusion of opportunity, of change, of elevation, while at the same time preserving the status quo. And so when we interrogate the history of the good and things that have been done under the aegis of the good, that is what resonates with me. It's what I see most immediately. Let's talk about an example. An example from perhaps what might be considered as the first digital good, or at least the first digital, large-scale, fully scaled good, which is, of course, thinking about the internet. We all know. Remember when the internet was black? Usually when I put this question up, it's rhetorical. I'm noticing from the faces in here, probably rhetorical. I'm sometimes in some audiences where people are like, yes, right? And there's a reaction to this moment, but I put it up in this rhetorical way to describe a moment I think perfectly illustrates moments where we must decide what the good really means, what it actually is, what we hope its outcomes will be. And so the point I'm getting at here is a moment in time that was bounded, let's say from about 1992 to the far side being about 1999 or the year 2000. So what do I mean by the fact or the question, remember when the internet was black, or the assertion that the internet was once black, as I make here? In a nutshell, it means that there was a moment in time where the internet as we knew it at that moment, and in fact, the internet as we now know it, was built on Black culture in many, many different forms. And so you'll see here, and these are some of the folks I talk about in Black software, and had the good fortune over several of years to really engage, to really come to understand this moment in our technological history where something comes onto the playing field that is touted as being a massive public good. And we can all remember or trace the history of all of the things, the aspirations that we connected to the internet of 92, 93, 94, when it first comes onto the public scene, right? It was going to revolutionize democracy. It was going to make the world more inclusive, in part because we wouldn't know and couldn't see what each other looked like or what our identities were. It was going to mask all of that and therefore hide our prejudices and make it into a world in which those prejudices wouldn't govern our interactions, right? This was going to be something good for all, for everyone. If you look back into the speeches that took place by political leaders in the US and beyond, at the time, you were seeing and hearing this being the moment of economic opportunity, in particular for folks who were at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. This was a new platform that was going to usher in potentially racial equality, in part by building a platform on which people of color, people who have typically been left out of the labor force, could renew their economic hopes or their hopes for economic mobility, equality, et cetera. And so a lot of aspirations mapped onto the internet in this sort of domain of the good. And what we have here, I'll talk a little bit about and give you a little story about the three entities that are represented here and the people behind them to try to illustrate what it is that I'm trying to drive home here. On the far end, go closer to where I can actually see, we have a website began around 1994. It's called the Universal Black Pages. It's built by a guy named Derek Brown, who was at the time a graduate student in electrical engineering at Georgia Tech University. He and his fellow students in the Black Student Union at Georgia Tech essentially saw the internet coming online, saw all the new features and potential, and said, what we would like to do, what needs to be done, is to have a way of connecting all things Black that was starting to creep up on the internet. And so all the disparate sites and pages and so forth that were as far away geographically as the US and Africa, Canada, down into the South, the Black diaspora from across the world, that was popping up on this new platform called the internet, that in 1993, 94, people really didn't know what it was or what it was going to be about. And so Derek Brown began this as a project that was what we could call a digital good project. That is, he approached his work in particular as, how do I do something good for my community by introducing them to the power and potential of this new platform? And what they saw as their unique value add was to make connections. And so the Universal Black Pages sought to connect all the sites and the people and audiences and users of those sites so that they could collaborate, so that they could communicate, so that they could do all kinds of things. Interestingly enough, Derek was on one side of an equation than some of these other two other platforms, one being Net Noir, the other Black Voices. Both of these entities differed from the Universal Black Pages in that they became commercially successful. And when I say commercially successful, I mean among the most successful digital ventures in that period of the early mid-1990s. And so I won't go into the stories too much, but to say that when I talk about the internet being Black, I'm talking about two things. Number one, that Black culture and Black people in a moment having the power to drive what this new thing was going to be. And remember, this was a time when folks' most imaginative idea was, we could digitize the phone book, things of that nature. No real sense when this new innovation came what we might do with it. Also no real sense about how we would make money with it in these first formative years. And that became a space, an opportunity for Black people, Black culture to have a foothold and in some way be the centrifugal force of what that platform became. The second thing, what I mean by this is that when the AOLs of the world, when the CompuServes of the world at that time were trying to figure out, how do I make money off this new thing, to whom did they look? They didn't look to all the engineers who built the stuff that we typically associate with the invention of the internet, right? They began to see that the internet is not gonna just be this hardware, even the software that we use to build things, that the internet was gonna be about people and about people connecting. And so as people began to think, all right, how do we make money off of this? The early sense was that it's gonna be something related to how people connect. And for that, for inspiration, for ideas, for models, they look to these folks and many, many others. in very real ways and said, can we essentially replicate what you've already built in forerunners to the internet, et cetera? Can we do that in a way to build what this thing will become? The final thing I want to say about the internet and really its association with the digital good is that this moment where there is both influence and prominence, so if we look at those brackets, the other thing in terms of both the influence that Blackness had on the early internet also had to do with visibility, right? When there are relatively few websites at the time where this is forming between those brackets, you've got, I'll put it this way, the Universal Black Pages had about 50,000 links to other Black sites across the web at the time. And so you're talking about roughly, depending on the year you market, this is about 20% of the websites online. And to think what that means in terms of both visibility and influence in an early web, but the point, of course, is the rest of the chart, right? This all disappears by 2000. All the businesses that were built were massively popular. Those who built them, by and large, cashed out, turned them over to other entities. And by the time we get to 2000, you're hard-pressed to find folks who are prominently and commercially on the web who are Black. And so the question is, why? And for me, it is and goes to the heart about what I think is missing when we think about the digital good. That is, that the digital good often creates a vacuum, right, that gets filled typically with those who are already white, wealthy, and powerful, right? So we say, this is gonna be something we're gonna build, and it's gonna be for good. And we usually couple that with, this is something we're gonna build, and it's gonna be for everyone. And we leave it there. And so what happens? That vacuum gets filled by folks who already have access, already connected to the networks of resources and power that give them a jump into this thing that is being built. And so it's something about the lack of specificity, about the good, that we don't tack anything onto often. What we mean by the digital good, who do we mean, what do we mean, when, et cetera. All those things that we've started to talk about earlier in the day. And so I want to start to transition to talk about what the digital good might be. And to do that by saying, I don't believe that the digital good is not good, right? So it's not to think about the digital good or good in opposition to something else. The digital good is good for many reasons, but I think probably most importantly, that, and this came up in our latest round of talks right before this, that doing good is relational. To do good, by definition, means I have to interpolate, to have a conversation with, to engage those for whom this is supposed to be good. And so what ultimately I define by or as the good can only be done in conversation, in relationship to other people. And I think that is what the value of thinking about digital good is, which is that we cannot even approach digital good without calling into formation a relationship with the folks on whose behalf or with whom we are working. So we'll keep that in our minds. I want to quickly go to what we all are familiar with in terms of models of the good. 15 minutes, wow. Let me go back, I think one. All right, so we're familiar with this version of doing good. That is, we are doing good for people, whether this is digital good or other types of good, right? We're doing good for, and this model of good produces what we know as saviors, right? Heroes. And we know all the presumptions that come in with this model of doing good for. We know what your needs are. We know what your hopes and dreams are, or we simply don't care. But we have a thing, and we want to give it to you, right? And we're not going to question whether or not it's the thing you need or the thing you need now or the way you need the thing that I'm prepared to give you. I'm just going to do it, right? Historically, the one laptop per child comes to mind, right? The same instance not too recently or too long ago, at least in New York, basically the same pattern. All the kids are out of school. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to give them a Chromebook. It's going to solve all the problems, right? And so there's a thought about, let's do something good. Let's give these people Chromebooks. And what? It was good, right? People have something that they did not have before that could be useful, but whether or not it was actually good was a whole different question. But it was a question we didn't ask before. We just said, let's flood the city with Chromebooks to kids with very different backgrounds and families and parental structures, so on and so forth. But this is the doing good for. It's the model of philanthropy that we've known for some time. It's often been that thing we know best as a model of philanthropy and engagement in continents and places like Africa. We do for, we have no care about whether you need or want. Your decisions aren't really a part of what it is that we are doing. Then there's the doing good with, which I think we might summarize with the word of allyship in some way. And so these ways of working see the people and communities that we're working with differently than the Savior, generally and particularly about understanding positionality with respect to who we are, either as racialized beings or whether we're academics and what our relationship to others and the people who have different professions and life choices and circumstances that we're working with. But doing good with, I think most of us would say, is a better model than the doing things for, because it's based on an idea of respect and mutuality and attempt and understanding of the lived experiences of those with whom we are working. And then there was another one that I like to talk of as doing good by, right? I've done good by that person, we've heard it said. What does that mean? It's probably an imperfect connotation here, but for me, it's about that I've done the thing, I've set you up in the best possible way, and now I'm ready to move on, if that is what is necessary. Right? And so what you can faintly see, maybe there in this last square, is a woman who is simply walking away. And so what I'm trying to get at here is a little bit of these models of working or doing good being a combination of several things, maybe the resources and the willingness to give of the savior complex. Right? I will take your money and the things that you will provide, but that in addition to a kind of position and way of working that looks more like allyship. And then a third thing that is really about what comes next, right? I'll illustrate this in another story, and this was a conversation that we were invited to, and this is a group of folks that some of you may know, Ruha Benjamin, myself, a friend, Andre Brock. I'm trying to remember Sophia Noble, who were approached by I'll just say a large company, we'll leave it at that, and asked, what would it mean for large company to really be a part of what you see as building new Black technological futures? And essentially what we ended up saying is take a lot of money, right? And this was, I hope I'm not outing her too much, but I'm sure she would be perfectly fine with it. But this was Sophia Nobles saying, why don't you take about this percentage of your R&D budget and put that into this effort, right? A large sum with many, many zeros that shows a sense of dedication, commitment, seriousness, all those things that would make it worth it to engage and utilize the resources of a kind of company where there might be at least some sense of ethical conflicts or appearance of all kinds of conflicts. But this is what would make it worth it, right? This amount of money. And then walk away, right? Don't ask the question, well, what are you going to do with it? Don't say, all right, every year we got the accountability performance and the things that you have to supply. Just walk away, right? And it wasn't really about being tied to those kinds of strictures of accountability. It was about the broader thing of relinquishing control, right? This is a question that often comes up when we talk about things like reparations. Well, how are those folks going to spend that money if we give them reparations for X? Why do you care? Why should it matter, right? And so in part because of this history of Blackness connected to our history of the digital, our technological history, what we're trying to communicate is, look, we all know that the thing that's out there is so popular, this platform that is so ubiquitous. The signs of Blackness, Black people, Black culture are replete throughout it. We don't typically profit from it, but it's there and it is visible. And so invest all this money that you have, give it to folks that are committed to thinking about different futures and then being okay with what comes out of it, right? So this is what I'm trying to get at with this doing good by. I haven't seen the flashcard yet, but I know it's coming. That time is short. So I'm going to start to wrap up. And I want to do that with what has become for me, I think, a grounding in thinking about not only the digital good, but thinking about technological or technology futures. Is something I stumbled upon in my research for Black software, where, you know, what I confronted over and over again, time and time again, was this instance of, all right, we don't know anything about Black people's relationship to computing technology before 1994. If you go to some official sources, there are some official proclamations that Black people have no connection to the invention or innovations of the internet at all, right? And so as I took a journey back from what started as a project very much in the here and now around 2014, 15, that had everything to do about ways that Black people across the world were engaging digital platforms like Black Lives Matter to push political advancements, so on and so forth, there was this moment where folks have a facility, an expertise, etc., that showed us how to marshal these digital tools for these purposes. And so what I took from them was a sense that our history and connection between these tools goes much further back than thinking about Trayvon Martin, thinking about Ferguson, Missouri, and the start, and then what becomes a movement of Black Lives Matter. And as that journey took me back further to the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, where I did that thing that we all are familiar with as academics, as writers, and so forth, where I just had to say, stop, right? That's where I stopped in the beginning of 1960 and found myself confronting something different than what both our academic literatures and others had told us, which was that there was no serious connection between race, civil rights, equity, et cetera, and the dawn of the computing era that was finding its zenith at the same time as the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so one of the things that I came across was this op-ed by Roy Wilkins. Roy Wilkins was a civil rights activist. He was at the time the head of a very prominent civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization started by W.E.B. Du Bois and others, people that Roy Wilkins looked up to. And I was interested in finding this article, and so this op-ed for me does a lot of work and has continued to do a lot of work to help me think about things like the digital good, and to think about whether the digital good, as I conceive it, is good enough, and to think about what is that future that we should be striving for. What is that digital good enough? What is that different picture? And so Wilkins emerges at a moment where he's doing this. He's doing this imagining, and he's doing it through this particular op-ed. And so what I would like to take the last few minutes to do with your patience is to read this op-ed. I will not editorialize because of time, but certainly happy to go back to it as we get into the Q&A. But I think it helps us, define and put some real sense of, or help us get a real sense of what the digital good should be and what it means to do that very practically. I'll do one caveat explanation at the very end, because it begins saying the news that computers are now fashioning the ideal Holstein Friesian milk cow sets the mind working on facets of our ever-irritating race problem. The Holstein Friesian milk cow was a cow that was imported from Europe to the US, known for its superior milk production. Roy Wilkins noticed it because there was a lot of talk about how it was one of the first things that was automated, that scientists had connected a computer to it, monitored the cow's milk production, and used the feedback that the computers were able to provide through their computation to adjust the levels of food, et cetera, that they gave to the cows to produce this milk. This fascinated Roy Wilkins in thinking about, what can this new thing called a computer do? Critics of Booker T. Washington, he said, often remarked that he was teaching Negroes hand craftsmanship at the very same time such skills were falling before the onrush of the machine. Today, the Negro, still largely in the unskilled category, faces automation and the computer. The computer's work with the world's favorite black and white cow suggests that the race is about to fall farther behind than ever. The Negro's realization that he is confronted with a danger, one not completely understood, but threatening on all sides, may account in part for his present mood of belligerence. This is written in 1967, known in the US as the long, hot summer, where many race uprisings happened across the United States, many of them ending up in what folks framed as violent actions by Black folks across the US. What would you do if you and your family had been farming cotton all your lives and all too suddenly a mechanical method of weeding came along, followed by a mechanical cotton picker? If these disasters were but preludes to absentee ownership, consolidation of acreage, and diversification of crops, the chances are the sharecropper family would find itself in a strange urban community, hunting a job, a home, and a school. For the Negro former farm worker, the computer is but one more signal that he has been kept at arm's length while the rest of America pressed forward into the computer era. In the mass, he never got a chance to acquire the learning and the skills which would have enabled him to progress towards the use of data processing. He was not without ambition and initiative, but whenever he tried to move, he was slapped down. In 1919, for example, Arkansas Negro sharecropper in Phillips County had their meeting shot up. When they shot back, the state militia began killing Negroes at will under the guise of suppressing an insurrection. And this is what I often think of is the most important section of this particular op-ed, and it is a sentence that goes, "It was not intended that these Black farmers should be permitted to take even the first step towards better farming and bigger earnings." Right there is where the American system of individual enterprise and reward on the basis of ability broke down. It is precisely at this point in thousands of family histories that the difference between opportunities for the unskilled white immigrant and those for the unskilled Black American became manifest. When I now look into the skeptical eyes of bewildered white observers of this riotous summer, I think of the Arkansas sharecroppers, of Anthony Crawford, a Negro farmer who was lynched because he was, quote, too prosperous, of the Negro families who wore their old clothes to town, good clothes only for church services, in order to offer no disturbing comparisons with those of white folks. No, all Negroes have not been shiftless or without ingenuity or the will to get ahead. The hardiest have advanced despite obstacles and have fought and paid for opportunity for their children, but many scores of thousands who now should be given the overwhelming answer to the question of Negro ability were hobbled and crushed in spirit. The psychological children of this treatment are the 1967 rioters. Near relatives are their embittered but non-riotous supporters. And then he comes and ends with the question that I think was a prescient question in 1967 when he asked it. And I think that if we were to have heeded it or engaged it in 1967, we may have had a very different technological future. But I think the frame of the question is the kind of question that models for us what should be our approach to thinking about the digital good. After the computer, he says, has defined on tape the ideal Holstein, could it then turn its impersonal, unprejudiced magic upon our agonizing race problem? Could it not, after digesting the facts which both whites and Blacks have fogged over for so long, give us an outline of our obligations? Instead of being a measure of the Negro's lag, cannot the computer become a guidepost to interracial justice and peace? I won't say too much more about that, except to summarize what, at least for me, this and Wilkins' words say about the digital good. Digital good is good, right? So I want to be clear about that. Even being skeptical of ways that it has been marshaled and utilized and so forth, digital good and doing good is better than what it calls into question, which are digital harms. We put it that way. So the digital good is good, but what helps us to make the digital good more than good, right? To be enough, to be something more approaching our ambitions and our ideals. And I will offer just these two assertions that digital good is not good enough unless it shifts power. I think what Roy Wilkins does in the framework of his op-ed is to showcase for us how deep and difficult that is. But that if we are supposed to do digital good with real seriousness, it means confronting power. It means dealing with the fact that there are some people who very intentionally do not want to relinquish power, right? And have interests that serve to maintain the status quo and power where it currently resides. And so the message is not to think about or to pursue the digital good, it is to not let the good become the enemy of the revolutionary. I will stop there. Thank you. And I will end on that slide. And if there's time, I can explain the visual.
Thanks, Charlton. Sorry for the delay. It takes ages to turn this microphone on. This is not a digital good. Okay. We have an opportunity now, about 25 minutes, to have a discussion, questions, so on and so forth. We've got folks online, and I know at least one question online, and I will invite others to pop their hand up as well to ask questions. In the spirit of people online being able to hear, I'm going to let this microphone rove. There is, for an inexplicable reason, only one microphone in this enormous room. So I'm going to say goodbye now, and you won't hear me again until I've got it back in my hands. So if anybody in the room has a question, then do feel free to put up your hand. If not right now, I have one to begin with, obviously. Always got a question. And it's this one about the for all. So you mentioned this sort of this, repulsion wasn't your word, but the idea of the good. Immediately you have a visceral reaction to it, and it seems as though for all also in the work that we do in the network, and more broadly you see it institutionally now, this presence of the idea of inclusion, of bringing everybody along, and the for all just sounds better than the not for all. So can you tell me where I'm wrong?
Thank you for that question. It's not so much that that nomenclature is wrong, right? Of course, when we say something is for all, what we mean is that it is maximally inclusive, includes all of us, right? All of us that are represented here. So what I'm getting at is that corollary of what I see with the sort of vagueness of the digital good, which I also see with these calls for X for all, which is that it sounds inclusive, and it is, but it ends there, right? It doesn't go to the next step to say, what does this actually mean for us, to then make sure that actually every one of us benefits from this thing, right? It is a way we innovate, which is to say, I built this new tool, come and get it, right? It's accessible to all. It is for all of us, maybe even in that way. But if there is no way to ensure that we all, each of us, including our separate individual identity, the groups that we inhabit, that we're all included and brought to that thing, then what de facto has happened historically is that those with money, power, and privilege have the ability to access that, and that's who dominates. And the folks that we built this thing for all for are still on the margins.
Was the black internet for all, or was it for black people? So I guess I'm pushing you a little bit further on that. Are there not cases where technology can be good and not be for all? Absolutely.
The black internet was for black people, or at least an instantiation of it. And so in the book, I talk a lot about a group called the AfroNet, which was an online community that grew up with the the older technology of the computer bulletin boards. So pre-internet bulletin board systems, and what the AfroNet did was connect networks of Black people across, this was typically geographically bound to Canada, United States, and some parts in South America. But what you had to do is you had nodes that were computer systems and host computers who would serve as the network, what they were called sysops. And these system operators basically gave access to other people to their network and all the things that they had on that network that people created, shared, et cetera. And so the AfroNet grew up as a way to connect Black people across geographical space, to build to community, to collaborate on things. Interestingly enough, going into the research project for this book and asking questions about this, which were, from my mind, very politically inflected, most people were like, this thing grew up because we were all trying to make a love connection, basically, right? We were interested in politics and some of those other things, but we were really looking for intimate types of connections with people who were not physically in our same geographical space. But that space was policed, meaning you gained access through someone else who was already a part of the network, and your bona fides were that you were Black. And typically what happened was that the folks in a given geographical area would come together offline, in part to verify that you were Black. And so that's one part of the question. I think those types of communities had value and were good. And I think that when we think about what went forward, I'll put this in the language of David Ellington, someone I referred to earlier, who was one of the founders of Net Noir. David Ellington, whose last name Ellington you're familiar with perhaps because he was a grandson of Duke Ellington. He was an entertainment lawyer. And the way that he ended up building this company, Net Noir, was because he recognized something. He basically said, look, from time immemorial, essentially, from his state of mind, people love Black people, right? Or at least they love Black culture, or at least they love Black cultural artifacts, right? If we look through our art and our music and all these things, it's replete with Blackness that we replicate and sometimes steal and all these things, but that's what people like, even white people. And so his idea was, if we make Blackness the center of the internet, then it'll be for everybody. And they spoke and used those words, interestingly enough, when they were launching the site, that this was a Black site, but it was for all. It was for everyone, but it made sure that at the center of it were the people that they were centrally concerned about and with.
Thanks, Charlton. I'll shut up now. I've invited you all to ask questions. I know we've got some online. We do have one in the room, so I'll go to the one down here first. I know it's bullish of me to invite questions and then give lots of caveats, but please introduce yourself and also keep it brief because I can see other questions starting to pop up. So, Rima, if you could introduce yourself now.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Rima Patel. I'm a co-I of the ESRC Digital Good Network. I'm really interested in this notion of allness because I'm reminded of two things. One is this cost-benefit analysis mindset that has come into government decision-making, largely because it's been inspired by utilitarianism, which was this sort of British philosophy, which broadly said that we should maximize good for the most number of people. That's kind of a really crude simplification of it. And of course, this has filtered through into all sorts of decision-making, including tech decision-making. And it really illustrates what happens when you pick one notion of goodness, which is this notion of goodness, and you ignore the others. And actually, it's a really controversial philosophy. And now it's just, we see cost-benefit analysis and the greatest good for the greatest number, I think was the way they described it. And this idea of allness is very similar to that idea. But of course, what it overlooks is, that individuals are unique and the greatest, the think the same intervention will affect people differently. So it was just a reflection on your talk, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. What comes to mind to me is something I really encountered with a student I had in a graduate course some years back, and it was in thinking about the way search engines are built and the logic of search engines, which is very much this, right? What people want is what the most everybody else wants, right? A model of popularity. And so the question that's often not asked when we talk about this, the greatest good for the greatest number is, what about that number that's not in the greatest number, right? Is that simply okay for us to leave dangling? And what this student had done a research project on was looking at the prominence of information online about breast cancer for Black women, and really demonstrated the ways in which our logic about popularity in terms of search engine results result in a dearth of accessible information for Black women that were experiencing something with that particular condition. But it illustrates to me particularly what you mentioned, which was we think this sounds good, right? For the most number, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but it doesn't open us up to thinking about, all right, who is left out? And should we just go with that, or should we actually design or distribute or proliferate goods based on that rather than the other?
Hello, I'm Lexi Webster. I'm principal investigator for the Queer Joy as a digital good project.
Yes.
And my question is about those three principles of doing good with, for, and by, and goes back to Roz's question about who are these for? Are they for all? And really, I'm asking, is there scope for a fourth spoke of doing good as? Because your reflections on the Black history of the internet and the internet being Black seems like that's Black communities doing good as Black communities. And I think that my question really is there scope for us to think about doing good as Black communities, doing good as queer communities, and kind of eschewing that power and privilege and capital that comes from the people that already have access to those things?
Yes, is the short answer. And I love that, either as a fourth or as a stand-in for the third, which it might even be better for. So thank you for articulating that. And I think what resonates with me about that question is, in large part, the subject of your talk earlier and the work, which is something about the normalcy of being us, for whom that us includes, right? And it is about that joy. And so I'm always in the back of my mind when I give a talk sort of like this, my good friend Andre Brock is in my ear saying, why does everything, when we talk about the digital good, have to be connected to something that is explicitly political, whether it's movements or rights or what have you? And why can't we just have space to talk about joy, which is what comes from us just being able to have the freedom to be us? And so I think it's beautiful to think about doing good as part of that, both a reflection of what we do that we know is good for us because it is us that's doing it. So I will probably steal that, but cite you as, of course, in anything future. But I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about these models of doing good. So thank you.
Webster, 2024.
Yes.
Okay. We've got a question from online, then I see one up there, so we'll come to you just in a moment. The question online is from Panyota Satsu, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't read my own handwriting. Based on your book, if you could, Charlton, can you offer us any lessons about what we might learn from how racially minoritized communities have been excluded from other sectors, as well as in terms of computer science and so on? Is it mirrored in those other sectors, and what kind of patterns might there be to anticipate across those different sectors?
The answer is yes, right? So if, I mean, there are a few notable exceptions, but I think if we look at just issues about representation and underrepresentation, tech sector, which has stayed roughly the same for the last 50 years, or I should say for all of its 50 plus years, in terms of representation of African Americans, Hispanic, Latino, Indigenous, to some degree Asian folks. We see that mirrored in almost every industry. The places that we tend to see not the same patterns of underrepresentation tend to be in what's called sort of service area work. But I think by and large, we all experience, no matter if we're going from tech into banking or financial services, into other sectors, this problem of representation is there, and all the attendant problems that flow from it, that range from being able to imagine, innovate, and have one's innovations become the thing that everybody is part of, to simply being utilizers or users of what other people invent or build systems that we then have to work with, to having voice and influence into the shape of what gets proliferated, or the ability to say yes or no to new technological innovation. So all those problems that are at base problems about representation, I think, are across sectors. And I don't know that any of them do good in terms of an model for how to get out of that circumstance, right? The closest one that I would think about maybe might be something like racial gerrymandering, if we look at electoral politics, which basically says we want everybody to be represented. We recognize, at least as it comes in the form in the United States, that we're segregated geographically. And so we're going to make up for this representational problem by making it almost certain that certain people are elected from certain districts that represent large shares of people who live in that community, share same identity, connections, so on and so forth. So that might be one, but even that one has, over the years, been wildly imperfect, because as political scientists term it, there's a difference between the descriptive representation and substantive representation, right? All skin folk aren't kinfolk, some people have said that way. Just because someone looks like me does not necessarily mean that they will push the interests of myself and a particular community. So all that to say, I don't know that we have great models for getting out of that large problem of representation that runs across many, many sectors.
Another question at the back.
I'm Carolina Are, a postdoctoral fellow at Northumbria University and also in the Queer Joy project. My question is about your story about a platform that must not be named, and also your conclusion. And I was wondering, personally, as someone who does a lot of work trying to communicate with platforms, how do you find that our role as researchers should shift when we're invited to reflect some sort of lived experience or the interests of the communities we research? How good is it to interact with these platforms and these powerful people? Is it helpful? Is it a PR exercise? Is it in the middle? I'd be curious to hear your opinion.
We've clearly been living some of the same life for the last few years. I will put it this way. I've quit saying yes when the requests come. For a long time, I said yes, in part because I saw some value in the exercise, or I trusted certain individuals in terms of their motivations for asking and understanding what would happen with the feedback, so on and so forth. But I think it goes to this question, I think, about what's at the heart of digital good for someone like me who is thinking about not just doing something a little bit more than not doing harm, right? Somebody thinking more about how do we ensure that the technologies that we build today that will be scaled and ubiquitous work automatically for the benefit of people like me, or for the benefit of people who have traditionally been subject to the lion's share of harms from digital technology, right? What does that look like? And it's very clear those platforms aren't really interested in that, right? And so at the very best, it is a sense of how can I help make things a little bit better for people like me who are going to use this platform, probably to do some things that are good, right? I've got younger cousins. In fact, this is a platform of a cousin of mine who just started his own wrestling promotion company that is partly about, or primarily about, Black wrestlers who have largely been marginalized from mainstream wrestling. And so obviously a lot of his work that is based in the digital and on digital platforms. I have other cousins, a lot of cousins who are doing this work on the content side, primarily in beauty, skincare, all those kinds of things. And so they rely on this for their livelihoods. And so having these platforms optimized for them to be able to do the work that they want to do, I think is important. And so in some ways, I see that as valuable and am sometimes willing to lend advice or what have you as a researcher for those purposes. But largely, I've just not wanted to waste my time because our interests are fundamentally, I think, different. And so for me, I'm always the one in the room who they stop asking questions to after the first one when I was like, can we start over? Okay, gotta go.
Sorry, Joe.
No, go ahead.
Do feel free to put your hand in the air if you do have questions. My vision's not great. I'm wearing my contact, so shout if you've got your hand up. Oh, Sanjay's got one. We'll bring the mic over to you. Sanjay, please do introduce yourself and tell us about what your project is.
It's a very good project. I heard about it before now. Tell everybody else.
Thanks. So I'm Sanjay Sharma, involved in the project around looking at reimagining AI from an Afrofuturist and speculative design perspective. So I really enjoyed your talk, and it kind of struck me, I'm thinking not too far back, but when Elon Musk took over Twitter, and there was a point where a number of users left, and some of them went to Mastodon. It's kind of self-hosted, kind of independent, and there's the idea that it was kind of more, it was a space, or a more utopian space, because it didn't have a central owner, it wasn't big tech. But it was interesting from a number of sort of Black Twitter perspectives, and it wasn't just one perspective, where they said, well, we kind of know how awful Twitter is, but in that space, we've carved out a kind of social connectivity, a kind of a counter space, and Mastodon isn't necessarily a safe space for us either, because the safety features haven't really evolved. It's the different structure, and it requires an operator to kind of deal with the safety kind of on their own or in small teams. So it was kind of depressing because on one level, I kind of hate what X is in a way, and always have. But it enables certain kind of communicativity and connectivity. Despite its design, like the Black Twitter hashtags, for instance. And Mastodon, on one level, the promise of it seems, yeah, that's what we want, something independent, but it doesn't seem to be delivering. And it just struck me when you talked about the Black internet, and the idea of shifting power, what spaces do we need to work in to achieve that?
That's a great question. I think there are two issues, right, in both of these moments that I think are critical and that are fundamentally different. When we look back to the early 90s, that's different from now. And I think it's a question about ownership and scale. Maybe I'll add a third, which is just sort of broadly barriers to entry, right? What enabled all those things to happen in the 90s was because what it took to create digital content at the time was fairly accessible, right? And so you had folks that said, look, all I had to learn was the AOL code to do this thing, and all of a sudden I've got a platform within its walled garden that enables me to build something like Black Voices, and then leverage that to a more open community that then gets bought by AOL, or I'm sorry, the Tribune Media Company, then AOL, so on and so forth. And so the barrier to entry was significantly lower. And that's in terms of sort of quote unquote technical skill and know-how, and some other things I won't go into. The other was that there was a moment where money, I won't say was free flowing, but there was a lot of it in this moment of speculation and experimentation that allowed for these companies at that time to seize and profit from, right? And so there were some folks in the VC community at the time that said, looks like a great idea, amongst others, looks different in a lot of ways than others, recognize the power of sort of Black culture in leading and these particular teams of people, and had a moment where it was not seen as a loss to fully kind of fund these teams to make something happen. I don't think either of those things exist in the same way today, and I think it's particularly what has us in this moment that you illustrate with the example of Black Twitter. I think it was maybe around this time last year, I was invited with a few other academic scholars who are in the Black Twitter community, researchers, and a lot of prominent folks in that sort of Black Twitter environment, who are not academics, users, many of whom make their living in some way through that platform. And the question or the reason for bringing us all together was to think about, all right, well, what's next, right? We can see this is already a dumpster fire. It's going to probably get worse. And so what comes after, now that the thing that we feared, which is when we do something that was not intended with this platform, what happens when essentially the platform goes away? We confront the question not about the existence or prevalence of ideas of what could replace it and work, but it's about what exists for us to take those ideas and make them scalable in an environment today where folks aren't willing to give the kind of money that it takes to experiment with failure over a long horizon of time. And so if you can't demonstrate that, oh, this is gonna be popular and scale in a moment, then nobody wants to give you the money. So the ideas are there about what could come next, but the lack of capital and investment, I think, is a significant missing piece of the puzzle, and which is why, the Mastodon, at least, there are many critiques about it, but one of the clear things is that it has a higher barrier to entry than Twitter, right? And just in terms of the mechanics of the platform, and what it takes to get on, what it takes to find your people, so on and so forth. And so, so those are user characteristics, platform characteristics that create that barrier. But I think the real other one is capital, and that is what has prevented, I think, Black users, inventors, innovators in the digital space since the early 2000s, unable to really build profitable online internet-based businesses, because there isn't this horizon of capital that says, go do the thing. And if it doesn't work, you still have the money, and we can wait 5 years or 10, or maybe it never will, but we will still invest. And that's the kinds of things that tend to go into other companies that have become successful, scalable, et cetera, in terms of level and commitment of investment. I've been off of Black Twitter for a long time, and then somebody kind of hailed me the other day, and I was like, hey, and then there was nothing. Like, it's gone.
I pressed the wrong button on the microphone, broke it. So I'm going to bellow at you all now. You won't know, but if you weren't here today, for many who were, my colleagues who were chairing had a preternatural ability to keep the time, and I have run us over by a couple of minutes. So I'm going to do goodbye you and say thank you so much.
Thank you.
Offer you a round of hearty applause.